If you'll remember, the title of this series that we've been going through is called Fear, Anxiety, and Panic. And for the first Sunday or so, I talked about fear, and then for the next couple of months, I talked about anxiety. Went through about 10 or 11 synonyms of anxiety, and we saw many examples in the Bible of people that suffered with anxiety, and I'll list them off here later on in the sermon. I just jotted them down as I was thinking about them this morning. And then we looked at the causes of anxiety last Sunday. And now I want to get to the last part in the series, and that is dealing with panic. And so we want to look at panic and panic attacks. And believe it or not, I have 3 examples of 3 legitimate, like textbook panic attack cases in the Bible, which is quite interesting, or terrifying if you've had one before. And then I want to get into, for the remainder of the series, how to deal with anxiety, fear, and panic. And we've covered some of that along the way as we've gone through all these examples, but I want to give a lot more information, pull some of those examples together, kind of put it all in one package, and that'll take several Sundays as well. So this turned into quite the gargantuan study, especially considering when I set out to do it, I figured there was about 4 or 5 verses in the Bible that would take me about 10 minutes, and turns out there's an incredible amount of information on this topic in the Scripture, as you have seen. All right, so let's start off by defining panic, and this is very interesting, where this word comes from if you didn't know. And chances are you probably didn't. I didn't either until I had read about this a few years ago. Then I forgot, and I defined the term again, and I remembered what I had read years ago. Panic, the adjective, when used in panic fear or panic terror or something like that, is such as was attributed to the action of the god Pan. So there was one of the old, I think he was a Greek or Assyrian, or I forget what he was, but anyway, some old fictitious god anyway named Pan, and Pan was known to inflict this terrible, excessive fear on people and put them in a panic. So that's where the word panic comes from, was from this old god Pan, which of course was no god at all. It is of the nature of or resulting from a panic, exhibiting unreasoning, groundless, or excessive fear. And that's a good definition of panic right there. Unreasoning, groundless, or excessive fear. The noun, panic, means contagious emotion such as was ascribed to the influence of Pan. It is a sudden and excessive feeling of alarm or fear, usually affecting a body of persons. So this can have like a group effect on people, and you'll ever notice that if you see one person get into a panic in a group, then a lot of times then the whole group gets into a panic. Think 2020, right? Remember what happened in 2020? I mean, everybody was in a panic. Everybody was going crazy because they were all being fed all this stuff in the media and got them all into a frenzy. Usually affecting a body of persons, originating in some real or supposed danger vaguely apprehended, and leading to extravagant or injudicious efforts to secure safety. So, being interpreted, people will then do crazy things to try to find safety, things that maybe don't make sense or that are even just flat out wrong. Panic, the verb, like to panic, is to affect with panic. It is to get into a panic, to lose one's head. So as we saw from the definition there, a panic attack, and we use this term all the time today. I don't know how long people have used the phrase panic attack, but a panic attack causes sudden, unreasonable, and excessive fear. And I have experienced them, as I've told you in this series, and it is an indescribably horrible feeling. It's absolutely terrible. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. And also, by the definition there, we see that a panic attack will make one feel like he's losing his mind, and he really is. When you're having a panic attack, you are losing your mind because you are afraid of things that normally, if you were in your right mind, you would not be afraid of. But you're in an altered state. Your mind has been so weakened and so fatigued that it can't handle the normal fears that would come upon it and say, no, this is nothing to worry about, and it gets into a spiral, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I want to give you 3 examples in the Bible of people who had panic attacks. And the first one is a man after God's own heart, King David. King David. This is why I say, and I've said this before in this series, it doesn't matter if you're the most powerful man in the world. It doesn't matter if you're the wisest man in the world, like Solomon. I mean, we got Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, most powerful kings in the world. Solomon, one of the most powerful kings in the world. Richest man in the world. Wisest man in the world. It doesn't matter if you're one of the most godly men in the world, like a man after God's own heart, King David. These things can happen to anybody. And King David experienced what we would call today is a classic panic attack. If you turn to Psalm 55, I'm just going to read here just a few verses, and David describes what fits to a T as what we would call a panic attack. He said in Psalm 55 and verse 4, the first part there, that his heart was sore pained. He says, my heart is sore pained within me. I'm just going to go through this just part of a verse at a time and define some words here. His heart was sore pained. Now the heart primarily refers to the bodily organ, the hollow, muscular, or otherwise contractile organ which, by its dilatation and contraction, keeps up the circulation of blood in the vascular system of an animal. We all know that, right? So it primarily refers to that muscle in your chest that pumps your blood. Now, when he said, my heart is sore pain within me, it's quite possible that he could be referring to his physical heart. It's probably more likely he's referring to something of an emotional nature, which the heart also refers to. It also refers to the seat of the feeling, understanding, and thought. And when it's used in this sense, it's basically equal with the mind in the widest sense, including the function of feeling, volition, and intellect. It's also the seat of one's inmost thoughts and secret feelings, one's inmost being, the depths of the soul, the spirit. It's also the seat of the emotions generally, the emotional nature, as distinguished from the intellectual nature placed in the head. So the heart can refer to both things, to the physical organ and to your inward emotional, intellectual nature, to your inward man, your soul or your spirit. And he could have very well been experiencing sore pain in both, because both of those things happen in a panic attack, as I will talk about here in a minute. Now he says his heart is sore pained. Sore is an adverb, and when it's used with verbs of grieving or annoying, etc., as it is here, it means so as to cause mental pain or irritation. It means deeply, intensely. So he says that his heart is deeply and intensely in pain. It also means with great grief, distress, which you'll remember distress was one of the synonyms of anxiety. With great grief, distress, or perturbation, that's disturbance of mind, in such a manner or to such an extent as to involve or manifest this. So he's talking about severe, intense pain in his heart. And pained means affected with pain, physical or mental. So this can, like I said, this can have to do with your physical organ or with your mental state. Affected with pain, physical or mental, hurt, distress, grieved, distressed, grieved, etc., expressing or indicating pain. So as I've said, extreme emotional pain caused by fear are characteristics of panic attacks. And so are physical chest pains. These also happen during panic attacks. And I have experienced both of these things, unfortunately. I experienced actually the physical part first, as I told you, when I was very stressed out about an upcoming trip, and I went to bed and I woke up about a half an hour later and I thought I was having a heart attack. And my heart, right where my heart was and going up into my neck was, I was in some intense pain. Like I really thought I was having a heart attack. And I laid there for a few hours. That's what it felt like anyway. Probably a minute or so, but I laid there for a while and just wondered if I'm having a heart attack, because I have, I've told you about my heart condition thing that I have too. And after a while, it wasn't going away, and I thought, well, as I told you, I probably ought to get up and tell my wife I love her, because this might be it. Like I really thought this might be it. This really feels like a heart attack, what I've heard of anyway. And so I got up and I went into the living room and my wife says, "Something wrong with you?" And I'm like, "I just wanted to tell you that I love you because I think I might be having a heart attack." And by that time, then it went away. I'm sure it was a panic attack. Like I said, I'm sure it was not a heart attack, but anyway, so it can cause these severe chest pains, but it can also cause great, deep emotional pain and horrible fear and just a terrible feeling within you that is indescribable. And I will tell you that if I had to choose between the physical pain, like the heart attack feeling, or the terrible, intense fear, I would take the heart attack any day of the week. Now, I don't want either one of them, but I'm telling you, if I had to choose between them, I'd take the heart attack any day. It was paled in comparison to the horrible, fearful feeling of a panic attack. But hopefully I never have to experience either of them again. That's what my prayer is. So whether speaking literally or figuratively about his heart being sore pained, David was likely suffering a panic attack, and verse 5 will strongly indicate this, and we'll get there here in just a minute. So let's just continue there with verse 4. So Psalm 55 and verse 4, he says, "My heart is sore pained within me, and the terrors of death are fallen upon me." Terror is the state of being terrified or greatly affrighted, intense fear, fright, or dread. Now, by the definition of terror, we can see that terror is basically the same thing as panic, because you'll remember the definition of panic was exhibiting excessive fear, and terror is basically that, greatly frightened, intense fear. Right? So when he says the terrors of death are upon me, he's describing panic. That's what he's feeling. Terrible, excessive fear. Then in verse 5, in the beginning of it there, he says that fearfulness and trembling are upon him. Fearfulness and trembling are come upon me, he says. Fearfulness is the quality of inspiring fear, dreadfulness, the state or quality of being affected with fear, timidity, timorousness. And then trembling is come upon him. Trembling when we're speaking of persons and less commonly of animals or of the body or a limb. It means to shake involuntarily as with fear or other emotion, cold or weakness, to quake, shiver, quiver, shiver. And it is commonly known that panic attacks do sometimes cause people to shake uncontrollably. And I know a person that this has happened to. I've talked to a person that told me this very thing, that when she was having a panic attack, she would just sit there and shake, couldn't control herself. And this is what David was experiencing. And this is why I said, I think it was in the beginning of this series, I said that the longer I live and the more things I experience, when I'm reading the Bible, I'm not reading it nearly as figuratively as I used to. Like David wasn't just saying, that my heart's sore pain within me. Like he's not really feeling pain. He's just kind of, he's just not feeling well. He's not, when he says the terrors of death are fallen upon me, he's not exaggerating. When he says fearfulness and trembling are come upon me, he's not just saying things to try to exaggerate and make a point. He literally probably was shaking uncontrollably and terrified. And could you blame the guy? If somebody was hunting you down for your life, chasing you from place to place, and you were continually running for your life from Saul, from your own son, from all of these things that David experienced, could you blame the guy for feeling like that? Then he says in the second half of verse 5, Psalm 55:5, he says, "And horror hath overwhelmed me." Horror is a painful emotion compounded of loathing and fear, a shuddering with terror and repugnance, strong aversion mixed with dread, the feeling excited by something shocking or frightful, also in weaker sense intense dislike or repugnance, the prevailing use at all times, it says. So horror, this terrible feeling of fear, has overwhelmed him, he says. To overwhelm is to overturn, overthrow, upset, to turn upside down. Figuratively, it's to overcome or overpower as regards one's action, or circumstances to bring to ruin or destruction, to crush, to overcome completely in mind or feeling, to overpower utterly with some emotion. So he was overpowered by this fear. Like, he couldn't control it. It had total control over him, and he could do nothing about it. And that's what happens during a panic attack or an anxiety attack, is that you are powerless to stop it. You can't just snap out of it, right? People that have never had one before would just say, oh, just snap out of it. Just get over it or whatever. You just don't snap out of it. You don't get over it. You pretty much just have to let it run its course. It will stop. It doesn't last the rest of your life, obviously. It usually doesn't last probably more than a few minutes. I mean, maybe some people suffer with them longer, but even those few minutes feel like days. But it will end. You just have to let time pass and endure it. And I'll get to that when I talk about how to deal with these things. I will get to some of that at the very end, actually. But it had overwhelmed him. It just had totally overpowered him, and he could do nothing to stop it. And I've experienced that very feeling, and the terribleness of it is beyond description. I wish I could describe it to you. I just can't. It is just the most awful thing in the world that I've experienced thus far, anyway. And then David desperately wants to escape from this terrible feeling that was afflicting him. Let's look at the next couple of verses. Psalm 55, 6 and 7. And I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then I would fly away and be at rest. Lo, then would I wander off and remain in the wilderness, Selah. And anybody that has had a panic attack knows exactly what David is talking about, what he feels like. You just wish that you could just feel better, that I could just fly away, that I could just get away from this, I could just escape it, that it would just end. Oh, that I could fly away and be at rest. That's what David felt like. And I completely understand. All right, let me give you the second example. So that was very short. That was only just a few verses, really just 2 verses actually describing a panic attack. But contained in those 2 little verses are pretty much, the characteristics of what happens when you suffer one of these things. But I have another example for you, and that was the Babylonians. If you turn to the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 13, and I just want to catch the context here in verse 1 and verse 6. And we see here that what's happening is that God is pronouncing a judgment upon them, and this is speaking of a panic attack that they would have when God's judgment came upon the Babylonians. They were the ones that destroyed the nation of Judah and destroyed Jerusalem. In Isaiah 13 and verse 1, it says, the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz did see. And then down in verse 6, it says, howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. The day of the Lord, I don't know if in every case, but in many cases in the Bible, when you read day of the Lord, it's talking about the Lord coming in judgment. This is not the second coming, this is not the end of time, but this is the Lord coming in judgment upon the nation of Babylon. The day of the Lord is at hand, which means it's close by. It's going to happen very, very quickly. It shall come to pass as a destruction from the Almighty. So then down in verses 6 and 7, just the next 2 verses, we read here a description of a classic panic attack. Their hands become faint, they're afraid, pain takes hold on them, they're amazed, which means they're stunned and stupefied, and their faces are like flames. Let's read verses 7 and 8. Therefore shall all hands be faint, and every man's heart shall melt, and they shall be afraid. Pangs and sorrows shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. They shall be amazed one at another. Their faces shall be as flames. Now, although, of course, the word panic or anxiety is not used here, but this is describing it. And especially if you've been through it, then you can identify what exactly that is talking about. The first thing there is that one becomes weak, and that happens in a panic attack. It says all hands shall be faint and every man's heart shall melt. You know, when your heart melts, you lose all your courage, you lose your strength, you become weak. That's what happens. Then fear takes hold on them with frightening grip. There in verse 8, they shall be afraid. Then he feels pain in his chest and other places in the body. There in verse 8, pangs and sorrow shall take hold on them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. So they've got fear, they've got weakness, they've got pain in their body. And then it's often also associated with sorrow and depression. Did you notice there in verse 8 it says pangs and sorrows shall take hold on them. And I've told you this before, that my experience has been that usually after you start suffering with bouts of anxiety, then depression and sorrow will set in and you'll suffer with that as well. And then in verse 8 we see that they can't think straight. It says they shall be amazed one at another. Amazed means driven stupid, stunned, or stupefied, as by a blow, out of one's wits, bewildered, confounded, confused, perplexed. Of things, it means thrown into confusion. And then we see, lastly, that their faces become flushed and hot. It says their faces shall be as flames. And at least that's been my experience. When I would feel an anxiety attack coming on, my face would get really hot. And I'm assuming if I was looking at myself, it would be really red. So their faces shall be as flames. So classic panic attack. Now the third example that I have of a panic attack is happening to Isaiah. See, Isaiah prophesied of this horrible judgment of Babylon, and when the Lord showed him the vision of what was going to happen to them, it caused him to have a panic attack. This is in Isaiah 21, 1 through 4. So I hope my descriptions of panic attacks aren't causing you to have one, because that's not what I'm trying to get at here, but I am trying to get you to appreciate what they are and to have compassion on people that have them. Because if you've never had one before, maybe you were like I used to be, and you're like, anxiety, big deal, get over it, and until you realize what it's actually like. And maybe that's one of the reasons why God allows people like me to have them, so that we can be more empathetic and compassionate towards others, and I'll talk about that here in a week or so. All right, so Isaiah had a panic attack when he saw this vision of the destruction of Babylon. Let's read about it in Isaiah 21, 1 through 4. It says, the burden of the desert of the sea, as whirlwinds in the south pass through, so it cometh from the desert, from a terrible land. A grievous vision is declared unto me. The treacherous dealer dealeth treacherously, and the spoiler spoileth. Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media, all the sighing thereof have I made to cease. Therefore are my loins filled with pain. Pangs have taken hold upon me, as the pangs of a woman that travaileth. I was bowed down at the hearing of it. I was dismayed at the seeing of it. My heart panted. Fearfulness affrighted me. The night of my pleasure hath he turned into fear unto me. So he was declared a grievous vision, he said there in verse 2. A grievous vision is declared unto me. Grievous means pressing heavily upon a person or persons, burdensome, oppressive. Of things, events, accidents, etc., which would be what this is referring to, an event, a grievous event that was going to happen. It's bringing serious trouble or discomfort, having injurious effects, causing hurt or pain. Definition number 5, going down a little bit. It says it means causing mental pain or distress. See, grievous can refer to the physical or to the mental. And Isaiah is suffering the mental part here. Causing mental pain or distress, now with narrowed sense, exciting grief or intense sorrow. So this vision that Isaiah saw caused him intense mental pain, trouble, discomfort, and distress. By just putting that definition in there. In other words, it caused him a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, and painful emotions. Now let's just look through some of the things that he said there. And once again, we're going to see classic panic attack. And he adds something here that is really interesting that I didn't find out until I defined a term. This is one of many times when I defined a word in the King James Bible that I thought I knew what it meant, and it turns out that it meant something different, or there was more to it than I realized what it meant, because words have changed meanings over time, and we are pretty much an uneducated bunch these days. And when I say we, I just mean our culture in general. So we don't know what words mean anymore, like they did back in the day. That's why when you read an old book, you got to have a dictionary right beside you and look up every fourth word, because we're so dumbed down these days. But anyway, it says there that the grievous vision caused his loins to be filled with pain, there in verse 3. He says, therefore are my loins filled with pain. And then he says that pangs, like the pangs of childbirth, took hold upon him. Pangs have taken hold upon me as the pangs of a woman that travaileth. Now those would be labor pains, right? Those would be contractions. And any woman that's ever had children knows what that's about. And I've been told that they're extremely painful. Well, Isaiah's experiencing pain like that. Imagine, ladies, when you went into labor and how much pain that was. Well, that's what Isaiah feels like as he's seeing this vision of what's going to happen to Babylon. He's having a bodily, visceral reaction to this. A pang, for those of us who haven't been pregnant, is a brief, keen spasm of pain which appears suddenly to pierce or shoot through the body or any part of it. A shooting pain. Figuratively, a sudden, sharp mental pain or feeling of intense mental anguish. And panic attacks can cause both of those things. Physical pangs and mental pangs. During a panic attack, fear can shoot across your mind and body and cause intense mental and physical anguish. Now, I haven't really had the pangs with an anxiety or a panic attack, other than the heart attack thing, but I wouldn't consider that a pang. It wasn't like a shooting pain. But I've had pangs for years, for over 10 years, and maybe longer than that, and I have no idea what the cause of it is, but I'll just get these shooting pains at different parts of my body for no reason whatsoever, and in some very uncomfortable parts of my body. I'll just leave it at that. But not just everywhere. And just all of a sudden, just out of nowhere. Like gripping pain. It'll just last a few seconds usually, and then it's over. I have no idea what it's about. I remember when I was in Ohio and I was working at my desk, and just one of those things happened. I'm just like, and some guy was just happening to be looking at me. He's like, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm all right. I don't know what that was, but I just get these intense shooting pains sometimes. So anyway, that's what Isaiah was feeling apparently. I'm just glad they go away and they only last a few seconds, because boy, a guy couldn't only handle so much of that before you'd be, I don't know what. He was dismayed at seeing the vision. Isaiah 21 and verse 3 there, the last part of the verse. He says, I was dismayed at the seeing of it. Dismayed means overwhelmed with fear, etc., appalled. So, again, he is, like David said, fear hath overwhelmed him, or fearfulness overwhelmed him. Isaiah is experiencing the same thing. He's overwhelmed with fear. He can't control it. It is just totally, it's like a flood that's come over him, and he's just totally powerless. Then, this is the really interesting part. His heart panted, which means to palpitate, which I didn't know. I was almost ready to jump up and start dancing when I read the definition of this word. That shows you what a geek I am. And if you know anything about me, you know that I would never jump up and dance about anything. I am not a dancer. Though there's nothing wrong with dancing, but there's something wrong with me dancing. Believe me, if you saw it, you would agree. Anyway, Isaiah 21 and verse 4. He says, my heart panted. Fearfulness affrighted me. My heart panted. Now I'm going to define pant for you. Now what I thought pant meant, and I was correct, that primarily it does, I was thinking of hard breathing, right? Like when you're breathing hard, or a dog is panting or something, he's sitting there and he's breathing really hard. That is what it means primarily. To breathe hard or spasmodically, as when out of breath. To draw quick, labored breaths as from exertion or agitation. To gasp for breath. But then I got reading a little further, and I get down to number 3. And you will see why I'm giving you number 3. It means to throb or heave violently or rapidly, to palpitate, pulsate, beat, said of the heart, bosom, etc. He said, my heart panted. So this is the definition we're talking about here. Number 3, it is said of the heart. Also of the blood. And then it cites Psalm 38:10 and Isaiah 21:4, the very verse that we're looking at here. It cites it for that definition. Definition number 3, to palpitate, pulsate, or beat. So you know what he's saying there? You know what's happening to him? He is having heart palpitations. Everybody knows, I think everybody knows, if everybody doesn't, everybody's going to know here in a minute, that when people have panic attacks, they have heart palpitations. Their heart starts beating very quickly and racing. This is exactly what Isaiah is describing, heart palpitations. This is fascinating to me. Like I said, I didn't think there was any of this stuff in the Bible, and then I just find it over and over and over again. I think there's more in the Bible about anxiety than there probably is about any other topic under the sun, to be honest with you. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. So if you ever do have a panic attack and your heart starts racing and you think you might be having a heart attack, just remember, this has been happening for thousands of years to people. And also remember what I told you about what I learned from Dr. Claire Weeks in her book, Hope and Help for Your Nerves. If you wake up and your heart's racing 100 miles an hour, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Because it's just a panic attack. And I say it's just a panic attack. But like Claire Weeks said, your heart can beat 200 beats per minute for hours or even days and not be harmed. So you wake up and your heart's racing 100 miles an hour, don't worry about it. You're going to be fine. And if I'm wrong, then you can tell me about it when you get to heaven. When I get to heaven, you'll already be there. But if I'm wrong, I'm sorry about that. But anyway, I'm just trying to calm you down that if this happens to you, you don't need to freak out. Although I don't know if you have a heart attack, if your heart starts racing like that or not. I don't think a racing heart is a heart attack, but I don't know much about it. But anyway, if you want to go to the emergency room, if that happens to you, go ahead. But if it happens to me again, I'm just going to lie there and just let it pass. And either I'll see you the next day, or I'll see you in a few years from now, one of the two. And then he says, fearfulness affrighted him. Isaiah 21:4, the second part. He says, fearfulness affrighted me. Now this is really interesting. Now you might read right over that and you wouldn't even think a thing about it. Fearfulness affrighted me. But you know what he's saying? Fearfulness scared me. Fear scared me. I got scared of fear. I was fearful of fear. And you think, well, that's weird. Why would you be fearful of fear? Well, that's classic panic attack. This is what causes panic attacks, is the fear of fear. See, once fear sets in, the body starts producing adrenaline, which energizes the nerves. And then the feeling of fear causes fear of the feeling of fear, which results in more fear. And it's a spiral, but it happens very, very quickly. It's not something that happens over the course of minutes. It happens over the course of like fractions of a second. And that's what causes the attack. You get the fear, your body produces adrenaline, that makes you more afraid, and then more adrenaline, more fear, and before you know it, you're in a total meltdown. The trick to it is, and I'll get to this later, that from what I've read, is to train yourself not to fear that initial feeling of fear and just let it go. Just let it come and let it pass. And when you learn to do that and not fear the fear, then eventually you'll stop having these attacks, and then your nerves will calm down, and they'll become less and less frequent until they just go away entirely, is the hope anyway, by the help of God. But it's that vicious cycle, that infinite feedback loop that causes the panic attack. And then he says that the troubling vision took away his happiness and turned it into fear. There, the last part of verse 4, Isaiah 21:4. He says, "The night of my pleasure hath he turned into fear unto me." Now, I take this to mean he's referring to his sleep, the night of my pleasure. I don't know about you, but there's not many things that are more pleasurable than just going to bed and getting a good night's sleep. I love going to bed. Don't get me wrong, I'm not some lazy guy that sleeps all the time. I sleep like 7.5 hours. But I love going to bed. There's nothing like crawling into bed and getting a good night's sleep, especially after a good day of labor. The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, the Bible says. And when you are suffering with anxiety or depression, a lot of times the only thing you want to do is go to bed. I've many times felt like the Lord said that Israel would feel like and say when they were under judgment, and they would say, "Would God it were morning," or "Would God it were evening." And I have many times thought, "Would God it were evening. I just can't wait to go to bed." Because it's just it's a way of escape. Just to go to bed and go to sleep. That is, if you can sleep. And if you can't sleep, God help you, because that is a terrible, miserable thing. But that's what I think he's saying there, the night of his pleasure. I think he's just saying that he can't sleep. And panic attacks often cause people, to not be able to sleep, and they often happen after people lie down to sleep. And I don't know exactly what the physiological reason for this is, but I have read and I've talked to people that said a lot of times they would have panic attacks after they lied down to go to sleep. And it might happen shortly after they lie down or right after they get to sleep. Well, that's when the one happened to me when I thought I was having a heart attack. It was only about a half an hour after I got to sleep. So there's something going on there. Maybe the brain just relaxes and then all of a sudden it gets attacked or something. I don't know exactly why it happens. But. All right, now I want to start into the next section. This will be the final section on how to deal with fear, anxiety, and panic. I will just get a drink before I start that. Now remember, I told you at the beginning of the sermon how many people in the Bible have suffered with this, and I just got thinking about it and just jotted down the ones that I could remember. And there's probably more. I didn't go back through the outline. But look at all the examples of people that suffered with anxiety in the Bible. Job, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Baruch, that was Jeremiah's scribe, Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, that was Nebuchadnezzar's son, king of Babylon, David, Solomon, Asaph, the psalmist, Joshua, Paul, and our Lord Jesus Christ. All of those people suffered with anxiety. As a matter of fact, Martha, Jesus' friend, she suffered with it too. And Paul talked about him and his companions suffering with these things. So there were many, many people in the Bible that suffered with this. It's not something new, and it's not something that's rare either. All right, so the first thing, and I'm probably only going to get through the first thing, I think. The first thing that you always want to remember when you're dealing with anxiety, fear, or panic is that you want to go to the Lord first for deliverance from these things. Go to the Lord first. I'm not saying, and I will make myself clear many times because I do not want to be misunderstood on this. I am not saying that you can never go to anybody else to get help. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying go to the Lord first. Let's turn to Isaiah 25 and verse 4. We're going to see here from this verse that the Lord is a strength to the needy in distress. And distress, as I've shown you, is a synonym of anxiety. Isaiah 25 and verse 4. For thou hast been a strength to the poor, a strength to the needy in his distress, or his anxiety, you could say, his stressful situation. A refuge from the storm. Think about the storms of life that we go through that cause anxiety. A shadow from the heat, from the intensity of it, right? When the blast of the terrible ones, as in a storm against the wall. The Lord is a strength to somebody going through something like that. It reminds me of Psalm 107, when you see 3 or 4 times when it says, then they called unto the Lord in their distresses, or they called unto the Lord in their trouble, and He saved them out of their distresses, right? When they were in a terrible storm at sea, or they were going through other hardships, called to the Lord, and He delivered them. So we always want to go to the Lord first. That's why when I go through, for the next several weeks here, and go through all of the measures to deal with and overcome fear, anxiety, and panic, I'm going to the Bible first. And I'll get to what the psychologists have to say at the end, at the very end. But I'm going to the Bible first, because I'm convinced that the Bible gives us answers to these things. You do not want to make the mistake of going to doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, and other people for help before going to the Lord. I'm not saying to never go to those people. I'm saying don't make the mistake of going to them before you go to the Lord. This is what King Asa made the mistake of, and it did not go well for him. 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 12. 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 12. And hear me, do not misunderstand me. I am not saying to never go to a doctor when you're suffering with these kind of things, or a specialist or a therapist. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you go to the Lord first. And I'm also saying that you give the Lord a little bit of time. When I say go to the Lord first, I don't mean talk to Him for 5 seconds in prayer and then call the doctor. That's not what I'm talking about when I say go to the Lord first. How many of you have ever had a problem and you prayed to the Lord and He instantly gave you relief the minute the words left your lips? Has that ever happened to any of you before? I don't think it's ever happened to me. I can't remember. God He doesn't operate like that. He lets you sometimes suffer with it for a little while to see if you're going to trust in Him, to see if you're going to have importunity and go back to Him, like the woman with the unjust judge and things like that. So I'm not saying, you don't just pray, I just prayed about that. Yeah, I spent a few minutes praying about it. Now I'm going to call the doctor, the psychologist. Give the Lord a little bit of time. And a little bit of time can mean different things to different people. I mean, I think I've given Him a little bit of time. It's been almost 3 months. All right, so, I mean, it's sometimes it takes time. But how much time you give it is up to you. I'm not dictating minute details of your lives. Anyway, King Asa, 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 12. And Asa in the 39th year of his reign was diseased in his feet, until his disease was exceeding great. He probably had gout. I don't know that for sure, but he had some terrible disease in his feet. And is exceeding great. Yet, in his disease, he sought not to the Lord, but to the physicians. Nothing wrong with seeking to the physicians. Jesus said they that are sick need a physician, right? But he sought to them and not to the Lord. He never bothered to go to the Lord. And this happens to people. When they suffer with things like this, the very first thing, go to the emergency room. Call the doctor, call the psychiatrist, whatever. It's just not even a thought in their mind to maybe go to the Lord with this and see if the Lord can help me with this first. See, this is where Christianity gets practical, right? It's easy to talk the talk. It's harder to walk the walk. Do we really trust in God? Well, if we really trust in God, well, let's go to God and see if He will solve our problems first and give Him a little bit of time to do that. That's what I'm recommending. Don't poo-poo or make light of seeking deliverance from God through reading the Scriptures and praying in favor of humanistic ideas. Because people will do this. Even Christian people will do this. They'll start poo-pooing that. Oh, well, yeah, I know it's good to read the Bible. I know you can get comfort from the Bible, but I think you should try this or that. Yes, I know prayer is good, but you should try this or that. When you say that, you're really saying, well, reading the Bible and prayer doesn't work. You're saying it in other words. And you don't want to do that. That's insulting to God. Don't say to yourself, yeah, I know the pastor told me to go to the Lord for help, but I need professional help. Now, maybe you do need professional help, but go to the Lord first, in faith, with patience, in humility. And then if you've done that sufficiently and you've done everything, maybe then it's time to go to a physician, because God uses physicians to help you. But go to the Lord first. That's what I'm trying to emphasize here. Help from other people may be necessary, and God may use others to help you, but make sure you go to the Lord for help first before seeking help from them. And I think Ezra is an excellent example of this, and I was so happy that I came across this passage. I was just going through my regular Bible reading. I read the Bible first thing in the morning, or almost first thing in the morning, every day for about an hour. And my Bible reading plan is very simple. I just start in Genesis, and I start in Matthew, and I'll read through a book of the Old Testament, I'll read through a book of the New Testament, then I'll read through a book of the Old Testament. So I'll read Genesis, I'll read Matthew, I'll read Exodus, I'll read Mark, I'll read Leviticus, I'll read Luke, and so on. I just read through the Old Testament, I read through the New Testament, and alternating back and forth. And I just do that day after day, month after month, year after year, and I don't know, probably read through the Bible once every couple of years maybe. I don't know. I don't get through it every year because I read slowly. Sometimes I might only get a chapter read in an hour, right? Or sometimes I might only get a few verses read in an hour. It's just hard to tell. But anyway, that was a bit of a side note. So I was just reading through Ezra because it just so happened to be that's where I was. And I read this passage and it jumped out at me, and it wasn't all that long ago. It was only maybe just a few weeks ago. And I thought that this was absolutely fascinating. Ezra 8:22 through 23. Ezra serves as a good example of trusting in the Lord for deliverance instead of trusting in man. Ezra 8:22 through 23. Okay, that's Esther. That's why that didn't look right. Ezra, a couple of books before Esther. Ezra 8:22 through 23. Ezra says, "For I was ashamed to require of the king a band of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy in the way, because we had spoken unto the king, saying, The hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him, but his power and his wrath is against all them that forsake him. So we fasted and besought our God for this, and he was entreated of us." Do you see what's happening here? They needed help. They had enemies that were trying to prevent them from rebuilding, like serious enemies that were physically trying to aggress against them. And he really could have used a band of soldiers from the king to protect him. But Ezra says, you know what? I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers because I had previously told the king, the Lord will protect them that are with him. I had stood there in faith and said, the Lord will take care of them that are with him, essentially. How did he say it? He says, the hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him, but his power and wrath is against all them that forsake him. So Ezra had stood there and publicly declared that the Lord's hand is with them that are with God, and that he's against them that are against God. I don't blame him. I'd be ashamed too, because maybe the king would say, Ezra, didn't you just tell me that the Lord's with them that are with him, and now you're asking me for a band of soldiers to protect you? I thought the Lord was going to protect you. Didn't you say that? Did you believe that when you said that, or did you not believe that? And Ezra was ashamed to ask him. I don't blame him. I would be too. This is why I say it's a lot easier to talk the talk than to walk the walk. It's easy to say, oh, the Lord will protect me. The Lord will take care of me. I've got nothing to fear. And then when you've got something to fear, all of a sudden it's like, whoa. Are you going to go to the Lord? Are you going to go trust in men? You're going to go the way of the world? You're going to do their thing? So Ezra decided, you know what? I'm going to stick with my principles. I'm not going to ask for the king's help. I'm going to trust in God like I said and like I believed before this trouble happened to me. See, he had publicly stated that God's hand was with them that seek him. And when hard times came, he decided to live what he preached and did not ask for help from the king. He and his people instead fasted and besought the Lord, and the Lord helped them. We saw that in verse 3. So instead of going to men, he fasted and besought God. He went to God in prayer for help. Now, I've tried to follow this principle when dealing with anxiety without medication. And plenty of other areas in my life where I've publicly stated my principles. That's the thing about being a preacher. If you're a preacher and you publicly state your principles, you better stick with your principles, because you're going to look like a hypocrite and you will lose people's respect. So as a preacher, you got to be very careful. If you are going to state your principles, you better darn well make sure they are actually your principles and you're actually going to do what you say you're going to do, because you'll lose people's respect very quickly. And I take very seriously what I tell you and what I preach to you, and I try to practice what I preach. So I've tried to follow this principle, like I said, when dealing with anxiety without medication. Now, I want to be crystal clear. I do not want to be misunderstood. So hear me out and pay attention to what I'm about to say. I do not think it is sinful or wrong to use medication to help to deal with anxiety. I do not think it is wrong or sinful to use medication to deal with anxiety. Do not misunderstand me. I am not in any way condemning people who have used or do use medication to help them overcome anxiety, whether they be Christian or non-Christian. I am not in any way condemning people who have used or do use medication for anxiety or depression. And I will say this, that not using medication for anxiety should never be done so that one can be proud or boast that he did not use medication. That is foolishness, that is pride, that is stupidity. If my reason for not using medication yet, and I say yet, I hope I'll never have to, and I'm doing okay now. I still have my bouts with it, but it's not bad like it used to be. I'm not saying I would never use it. But if my reason for not using medication is so that I can stand up here on my high horse and say, I didn't use medication to get over anxiety because I'm so smart or I'm so tough or whatever, I'm so spiritual, that is wickedness. And that is a sure way to be destroyed by God. So it is not a matter of pride or boasting, and it should never be. I will tell you why I have decided to make an earnest effort to overcome my anxiety without medication. And that is because I have found so much instruction in the Bible on how to deal with this using God's help. Like I said, when I started into this study, I didn't think the Bible probably had hardly anything to say about it. And I have been preaching on it for months. And I've got another more than a month to go. There is so much in the Bible about this. And I just became more and more convinced that if possible, I want to use God's method to deal with it if possible. And I don't want to use medication. That's one of the reasons. There's another reason, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But I am not saying that I will never take medication if it becomes absolutely necessary. Let me tell you what. If I had the kind of attacks that I had 2.5 months ago, and they kept happening over and over again, don't be surprised if I'd take some pills. Because that was absolutely horrifying and dreadful. And I don't know what human being could handle that repeatedly over and over again. So I'm not saying I would never do it. I hope I don't have to. And I beg for God's mercy on that. Now, there is another reason why I am very cautious and hesitant about using medication. And that is because I think people should be very cautious about taking anti-anxiety and anti-depression medication, as they can be very difficult and dangerous to get off of. Can be. I think it's pretty much an established fact. And I think everybody knows this. I mean, the warning labels tell you that these type of medications can cause suicidal and homicidal thoughts. And the media doesn't tell you this. They always like to focus on the guns. But from what I've read, in almost every single instance of a mass shooting, the person was either on these type of medications or had just recently gotten off of the medication, maybe like cold turkey or something like that. Almost every single one these medications are involved. Now, obviously, a person that would do something like that is messed up in the head, so maybe it's a correlation that they're on this medication and they're messed up in the head, and it's not the medication that's causing, them to do these horrendous things. I'm not saying that's the case. But what I am saying is, and the drug makers admit this, especially if you get off these things quickly, they can cause like major, major problems in your mind, suicidal and homicidal thoughts and things like that. Now, I know people who have used these medications to help them to get over the hump, so to speak, of severe anxiety, and were subsequently able to get off of them without bad side effects. I know a number of people that have been able to do this. I know a number of Christian people who have done this. Right? So it's not like it's crossing the Rubicon, and if you take this medication, you're on it for life, or you're destined for terrible mental problems the rest of your life. Not at all. I know plenty of people that were able to get off of them okay. But I also know people who have had a very hard time getting off of these medications, and in some cases were never able to get off of them. And I know about that too. I mean, our sister Bev, I don't think it's not a secret that she had severe depression. And I don't know if the medication made that worse over time. It's hard to tell. I don't know. But what I do know is that the medication would work for a little while, and then she'd go into a terrible depression, and then they'd have to up it, or they'd have to change it, or do something, and then it worked for a little while, and then she would go into terrible depression again. And it was just a roller coaster, and it was not, maybe it was the best thing for her, maybe there was no better option, I don't know. But it was not a good life when she was going through that. It was terrible. And she was never able to get off of it. Now, would it have been different if she'd have never gone down that road? I don't know. But I'm just saying, I know people, and she's not the only one. I have a friend of mine, his wife got anxiety when the whole 2020 thing happened, and she went to the doctor and got on some medication of some kind, and she had a horrible time getting off of that stuff, and put her into all kinds of mental turmoil. So I've seen both sides of it with people that I personally know, that it's worked really well for and that it hasn't worked well for. That's why I'm very hesitant myself. If you decide to take prescription medication for anxiety or depression, this is my advice. Be sure to create a clearly defined exit strategy with your doctor before you start. That would be my advice. You talk to the doctor and say, I don't want to be on this stuff the rest of my life, if at all possible. I don't want to get hooked on it. I don't want to get dependent on it. Whatever. Can I take this for a short time? How am I going to get off of it? How long am I going to be on it? What is the process? What are the steps that I am going to take to get off of this? Eventually, how long is it going to take, and so on. That's my advice. And that's the advice that I've read in a book that I've read that I will quote here in just a second. Now, that's just my advice. Maybe you don't agree, and if you're okay with taking the stuff, forever, then that's fine. I'm serious. I mean, if it makes you feel good and you can live peacefully and happily, and you're okay with taking it, then that's okay, right? But I don't want to do that if I don't absolutely have to. So that's why I'm just very, very nervous about taking anything like that, because I don't want to get hooked on something that I can't ever get off of, or that could possibly make things worse for me. Anxiety medication, once again, my opinion, I try to make my opinions known, I'm giving opinions. My opinion is that anxiety medication is only a temporary fix to help a person get past severe bouts of symptoms, but should not be a permanent solution in most instances. And I will read here from a book that I read by John Deloney called Redefining Anxiety. This is pages 19 and 20. He says the right medication can turn off or lower the volume of the alarms. If they're helpful for a season, take them. In the short term, medication can be a wonderful way to tone down the alarms that are constantly ringing, giving you a chance to catch your breath and do the deeper work that leads to lasting change. The alarms he's referring to are what I read in his quote here a few weeks ago, where he talked about anxiety being an alarm system in the body. So when you're having anxiety attacks, you're having heart palpitations, you're having stomach churning, your face is getting flushed, you're worried, you're scared. Those are alarm bells in your body telling you that something is wrong. That you've been overdoing it, you've been overextending yourself, you've been wearing yourself out, and your mind is tired and it needs rest. He's saying that if you have a severe bout of anxiety, taking medication to silence those alarms for a while until your body can have a chance to rest and recuperate is he thinks that's fine. Okay, and I don't disagree with that. But the thing is, and I will talk about this as I go through it, and I've talked about it some already, typically the reason you have an anxiety problem is not because you have a chemical imbalance in your brain. It's because you've been overworking yourself, overdoing it. You've worn your brain out so much that it just can't deal with stuff anymore. So to take pills to fix that problem, but to not change the behavior it's not a long-term solution, right? To take pills to give you a break and then to make behavioral changes and then to get off the pills after you made behavioral changes, in my opinion, that would be the way to go if you're going to go the medical route. But you've got to make the changes in your life. Otherwise, the pills are not going to be a long-term solution. I quote here again from page 20. Once again, I am oversimplifying here, but at the end of the day, all anxiety medications do is dial down or temporarily turn off the alarms. Silencing the alarm doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't stop the anxiety raging in your heart, in your relationships, or in your past. In almost every situation, medication is not a long-term solution to anxiety. You are. That's what he said. I would add to that, by the help of God, by the grace of God. God is the long-term solution to your anxiety, and part of that long-term solution is doing what God said in the Bible. Taking His instruction, His precepts for how we ought to live our lives and doing it that way, and see if your anxiety doesn't dial back when you start doing the things the way God says to do them. And I agree with him that medication is not a long-term solution. And I think of our sister Bev, and I hope she doesn't mind me using her as an example, but she's dead and she doesn't know anyway. But if we get to heaven and she's upset with me, well, she won't be, because we're not going to be mad at each other anymore. So anyway, but to use her as an example, she'd get on the pills and it worked for a while, and then boom, I mean, when she was depressed, she was depressed. I mean, it was terrible. I remember seeing that poor lady. She didn't come to church one time, and I went upstairs to knock on the door just to see if she was still alive, because, she was getting older. And she opened the door and kind of looked out the side. It was the most pitiful thing I've ever seen in my life. It was terrible. So anyway, then she'd get on some other medication, and it'd last for a little while, and then boom, she'd be down again. It's not a long-term solution, in my opinion. Now, despite a huge increase in the use of anxiety medications in recent times, the problem is getting worse, not better. Here's from Deloney again on page 16. But understand this, despite a massive increase in the use of medications for anxiety, no country in the world is seeing a reduction in the number of diagnoses. Despite billions and billions of dollars spent on anxiety medications, the anxiety problem is only getting worse. And he quoted in that book, over 40 million American adults have been diagnosed and suffer with anxiety. So I'd say, based on the fact that over 40 million Americans suffer with anxiety, and the fact that Americans are heavily medicated, it appears that anxiety medication is not a very good long-term solution to the problem. Because if it were, well, we probably wouldn't have 40 million people suffering with anxiety, would we? If the medication just fixed it, well, we, probably wouldn't have hardly anybody that's suffering with it. That's my opinion. I want to add to what I just said a couple of things, and these are just off the cuff, but first of all, you don't have to do what I do. Okay, what I do is my choice, what you do is your choice. Okay, so I tend to be anti-medication period, about I don't like to take any medications if I don't have to. But I know that not everybody shares that opinion, and that's fine. So if you think medication is the way to go for depression or anxiety, and if you haven't found anything else that is helpful, then go ahead and do it. I'm not telling you not to do that. Secondly, I know people that were on the medication, got over it, got off of it, and maybe they'll have some recurring symptoms, and they'll get on it for a little bit again. And it just helps to calm things down, and they get right back off of it. So that's certainly a possibility also. I also know other people that have tried to get off of anxiety medication, and they just get anxious as soon as they get off of it. And they tried a couple times, and they just seem to not be able to get off of it. And for them, it just makes more sense to just keep taking the medication, because there's just something going on where it just seems like their body just keeps reverting back to that. And it's just better for them and more healthy for them just to stay on the medication. It doesn't cause them problems. So I'm not saying that it's wrong to do that. And I'm also not telling anybody that may be on medication like that, that's hearing me through whatever means, I'm not telling you to get off the medication either, especially not without talking to your doctor. If you want to, then talk to your doctor about it and do it very cautiously. But if you don't want to and you're feeling fine, then I'm not telling you to get off of it. So sometimes I can get a little bit passionate and my opinions get blurred in with the preaching, and I don't want to put any burden on anybody to make you feel like you should never get on medication or you should get off of it or you're not doing right if you use that type of thing. It does say in Proverbs 8 that the wise find out knowledge of witty inventions, and there are witty medications out there that greatly help people. So there's nothing wrong with availing yourself of them as long as you understand the risks and the side effects and all that kind of thing. So anyway, I just wanted to add that just to make sure that nobody is under the mistaken idea that I'm telling you not to take it, or I'm telling you to get off of it, or I'm making you feel guilty about being on it. I am not in any way doing that. And I understand what it's like to suffer with anxiety, and I wouldn't want to see anybody suffer with that. And if medication is the only thing that helps you, then take it, because you don't want to suffer with that long term, that's for sure. So anyway, I just wanted to add that just to make sure that I didn't say something, leave somebody with an impression that I shouldn't have.
Just a quick note at the end of the sermon. The most important thing a believer in Jesus Christ can do is to be a member of one of God's true churches. If you're not already a member of one, go to pastorwagner.com/churches to see if there is a true church or other believers of like faith near you. That's pastorwagner.com/churches.